Typically, when your lease comes up for renewal, we look at economic factors, we look at location factors. We make an analysis of what's best. We look in the market to see if, it makes sense to move. Moving is an investment, but sometimes it's the right investment.
This episode was brought to you by Levy Health. Seeing more patients for a first consultation may actually decrease IVF revenue by 30 to 40%. To see why, download the numbers for free at levy.health/conversion. That's levy.health/conversion.
Today's advertiser helped make the production and delivery of this episode possible for free to you. But the themes expressed by the guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health, nor of the advertiser. The advertiser does not have editorial control over the content of this episode, and the guest's appearance is not an endorsement of the advertiser.
Opening a new fertility clinic, easy. Moving a fertility clinic location, easier. Expanding a fertility location, that's the easiest of all. Said nobody ever, and I brought in someone who has done it a lot. Is Lindsey McBain a household name in the fertility field yet? She ought to be. She better be after this episode. She's the Executive Director of IVIRMA America. She has moved, set up, expanded a number of RMA offices. She was a linchpin when they moved their big headquarters from Morristown, New Jersey to Basking Ridge, where they are today. We talk about the differences between moving an office, starting a new one, expanding one, which is the hardest, and what are the unique considerations of each. The difference between building a new office versus moving into an existing building with a lab without. She talks about what goes into scouting a location, her site needs evaluation, including variances in site plan approvals. Talk about when to buy versus when to lease. Talk about building a standard operating procedure for launching new locations like this so that organizations can do it at scale. We talk about the non-negotiables that should go into a letter of intent for a new lease. Talk about considerations for square footage. For those of you not looking to expand all over the globe, Lindsey gives a couple pro tips for what small offices can do to save money and hopefully not be logistically impossible. She gives pro tips for looking at blueprints ahead of time and as the site is being built. She talks about who's on her team, what their roles are each responsible for, and her outsource team when she goes into a brand new state, has to hire new architects, new project managers, how she does that, and how she selects vendors for each new site. I enjoyed this episode. If you enjoyed it, let Lindsey know because she gave us a lot of value for starting new locations, moving locations, and expanding locations. On to the conversation with Lindsey McBain. Ms. McBain, Lindsey, welcome to the Inside Reproductive Health podcast.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great after some technical difficulties and switching to an old software. We're recording this episode on Zoom, so I want you, the listener, to tell us, does it sound better, worse, or the same than the last several dozen episodes you've heard? Better, worse, or the same? I want your feedback, the listener, to let us know, because what I really want to focus on is the conversation. I've known Lindsey McBain for 7, 8 years probably, I'm thinking. We both have sit on the board for the Association for Reproductive Managers, of which Lindsey was chair. She went through that whole officer cycle. And Lindsey, you're not usually the loudest person in the room, but when you talk, people listen. And I'm one of those people. And one of the topics that I have clung to that you've spoken on over the years is about building new offices, building new labs, launching new offices, whether it's Terra Nova or not. And so I want to go through that concept with you today, and maybe we'll end up breaking them into categories of like brand new office buildings, brand new labs versus when you might put an office in an existing hospital facility or something like that. And you've done it across a number of states. So I want to ask about some of those nuances. But I'm interested in the first time that you ever launched a new office. Tell us about what that was like, because if my LinkedIn serves me correctly, you started your career in fertility with RMA at that time, RMA of New Jersey at that time, at pretty much the very beginning of the Great Recession. So pretty much the worst time to start a new job. It was September of 2008, if my records are correct. So tell us about what was the first mission that you were put on, because it's probably a very different landscape than what it looks like today.
Yeah. So when I first started, my first year at RMA, I did not do what I do now. After about a year and a half there, I got involved into operations. And at that time, RMA was growing and we were in Morristown. That was our headquarters. That's where it all started for RMA. But we were outgrowing it. It was getting way too small. So they were looking, even before I got there, they were looking for a building. They were looking to move their New Jersey headquarters somewhat in the same geographical area, but to move it, new lab, new OR, and be on our own. In Morristown, we leased space from the hospital, Atlantic Health. We were across the street from them, but this was going to be our own building, everything. So once I got in the field, I was started helping them go look at locations with Dr. Scott, Dr. Drews, and Dr. Berg. At the time, they were the three partners that were overseeing that. So we would go look at sites, we'd evaluate needs, we'd evaluate location, making sure that it was big enough that allowed for some growth and that it would be convenient to our patients and fit within our footprint in New Jersey. My first construction, though, I will say, was not that. It was a small satellite office for New Jersey. It was West Orange and Eatontown I did. And those were not labs. They were just office space locations for New Jersey, where those were the first two I did. I got involved in both of those. Probably I took them over from my predecessor. So those were my first two. And then we started working on the Basking Ridge project, which, like I said, I was involved from the search to negotiating the purchase to the construction with the partners.
Okay, so Basking Ridge is moving the headquarters from Morristown to Basking Ridge. And that's about a year and a half into your tenure at RMA. So this is
when it started, but it took a couple of years to find the location, to negotiate everything, to start construction. Nothing goes fast when you're doing real estate construction permits. There's a lot of red tape. Anyone who's done this.
Oh, I want to talk about that. I want to get to that of how it's, if you're thinking of a certain deadline, you should be tripling that in your mind. I want to talk about those expectations. So that's moving from Morristown to Basking Ridge, and that process starts in ideation in 2010.
Like I said, they were looking before I even got involved. But yeah, I think 2010 is when it really took off. I'm trying to think. I got married in 2011, and I know we were in the thick of things now, my honeymoon, because I was panicking being away.
Delightful.
So
that's a nice little honeymoon gift, worrying about what is happening with the contractors and everything else. But the West Orange and Eatontown, that happened before you chose the Basking Ridge location. So you were cutting your teeth a little bit.
Yeah, those are satellite locations, which with not having, ORs or labs or anything like that, and you're not buying a piece of property, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit easier. When you buy property, you typically have to do, well, for us at least, we've had to go for variances or site plan approvals. It's a little more involved. You have to get town approvals. It's different than just normally when you go into a location for a satellite. Sometimes you need a zoning permit with the local town, but typically that's something you can just handle with paperwork and fees at the local administration without having to appear before a board or getting a use attorney and putting a case forward.
It's like minor league versus major league, but I think it does merit some discussion, some of the lessons from those smaller offices. How much of a process did you have at that point? Like a standard operating procedure, this is how we open new offices when you were working on West Orange and Eatontown. How mature or not was that at the time?
So for me, it was brand new. We luckily had a GC that had done prior RMA builds with predecessors of mine. So he had some basic guidance. The partners at that point were very involved as well. So they were still looking at plans and giving feedback as well. So it was very helpful to have their input and their expertise. So I worked with them closely. I worked with the GC, and I just was learning everything. Anyone that had been involved in prior offices at RMA, I was picking their brain. I was just learning anything I could to try to figure out what I was doing, how to do it the best way, how to do it better. And I think I was just hands-on with everything. I was doing anything and everything I could so I could learn every piece of it.
What do you recall a surprise or a harder lesson being from one of those first two, the Eatontown, West Orange satellite offices?
I think just the coordination of the people and expectations. So you work on this whole project, and the people that are moving in usually aren't that involved. The staff, the everyday staff, and then to get them onboarded and showing up and all those pieces to fall in is harder than you think. You're so focused on the construction that you kind of forget how to embrace the people into the move and make them feel invested and excited about it and feel like this isn't a burden, but something that they should be happy for and that it's the right layout for them.
How do you make that decision too, especially when you have a number of different options that people could go? It's not like you're in one city and then you're just opening one satellite office 3 hours away. It's like they're fairly close to each other. There's probably people that live in suburbs in between. How do you make the decision of who goes where?
For staff, we look at the geographical area. If we're moving an existing office, we're typically staying within the same area so that staff will move. If we're opening a new office, we look for, typically you have your doctor first. So Eatontown was a new location for New Jersey at the time. West Orange was a move of one of our existing offices. So they were both a little bit different. With Eatontown, we were really building with Dr. Molinaro was the doctor there. He was very, very involved. But it was building a team there and building an office rather where West Orange, we were relocating a team to a new location. So it's a little bit different given the staff's there, moving them and reorienting them versus seeking out new staff. Or sometimes there's staff that wants to relocate that's commuting and it makes sense to relocate them. And then you have experienced people and they're moving with it. So there's different variables. But definitely for any of the builds, even the ones we have now, when you're going into a new area, the doc is key and they're always very involved and very crucial, to anything, obviously.
How often do you find that you're hiring new staff for offices that are not so far away, let's say within 20 miles or so? Are you hiring new staff specific to that area most of the time, or most of the time are you bringing folks over?
Sometimes the nurses and docs will have them in the system already, or at least the lead nurse will try to have in the system. But you're hiring new front desks. Typically, you're hiring, not always, but typically you're hiring new front desks, new clinical assistants, new phlebotomists, andrologists that are in that area. Again, sometimes you find someone who will move, but typically when you're opening a brand new location, like we recently opened in Jersey City, we did have to go to the local market and supplement the staff.
How much variance is there when you're opening, whether it's opening a new office like Eatontown or you're moving an office like West Orange? Do you find that, okay, this is typically the flow? If this doctor is going to be here this many days, if he's going to do this many NPVs a week, then it's this many nurses, this many techs, this many people for the front desk team. Do you typically have a formula that goes with each of those, or is it so variant depending on the doctor?
Well, it definitely is it's more variant on the volume. Our offices are typically 5 days a week. So we staff for patients to be there 5 days a week, whether we're staffing we do morning monitoring a little bit different in New Jersey than a lot of even our other locations because it's a block of time where you just come in where it's not scheduled. So 5 days a week that is open. And then there's new patient visits and stuff after that. Each department has its own staffing model, and based on the volume that we're telling them, they kind of go from there to assert the staffing. We definitely try in a new location to allow ramp up time. You don't want people sitting around doing nothing, but you also don't want patients not getting the care they need. So it's a balance of making sure, but it's all volume based, and every department kind of has their own metric for how to staff it and how many visits or how many rooms or numbers that they can fit for the staff.
Does that tenet of having 5 days a week for who you're open, is that like a minimum criterion for you all? Is that one of your criterion for opening a new place, that you just won't open a new place if you don't have a doc and a team to be there all 5 days of the week?
Right now in New Jersey, all of our offices are 5 days a week, and then we have some that are 7 days a week because of the geography of New Jersey. You need to be able to offer weekend hours in certain key locations. We don't have in every office. But because we go from Marlton all the way up to Englewood, we do offer multiple locations with weekend hours to serve our patient population and help decrease their wait on a weekend and their drive time. But generally, all our offices are Monday through Friday at minimum. And then we have the 7 days a week because we're 365 days a year. Yeah. We're always going.
A lot of people that are listening to this are in markets much smaller than the greater New York metro, and they're in markets that are a lot more sparsely populated. And so they do have satellite offices that might be open 1 day a week or 2 or 3. And But given that New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the union, it sounds like the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze for you all if you had to have an office that was only open a couple of days of the week.
No, and even when we open our IVIRMA offices, the original offices are always by about 7 days as needed. And then when they open satellites, we generally aim for 5 days, but you try to make sure you have the volume. But I can understand if a smaller market, a smaller one doc office, it's much harder to staff and make it worth it. I do know there are offices where they also share space with other providers to grow their footprint, which makes sense. At one point, we had a post in Overlook that we were only there 3 days a week, I believe it was. It was years ago. We're no longer in that area. But to get in that footprint, we had a doc go 3 days a week with a medical assistant who also was able to do front desk. And it had limited hours, but they were scheduled and it was there for that patient population. So it can definitely make sense. I mean, the idea is to be at the right location for your patients, I think.
Did you ultimately outgrow that location in Overlook, or was it, this is a pain in the neck having a doc out here for 3 days, and if we lose that medical assistant who can also double as the front desk, then we're in a tough position because that person's going to be hard to replace with one? And so was it yeah,
we grew our footprint in New Jersey, so it didn't make sense when we added offices. We were kind of covering that area with existing offices. When we grew our IVF, when IVF New Jersey came part of IVIRMA New Jersey, we kind of grew our footprint and we were in different locations, so it didn't make sense for us.
Seeing more patients may actually decrease IVF revenue by 30 to 40%. Many REIs see patients that haven't had any testing and are not ready or suitable for treatment. Patients that don't need IVF often feel they're being sold treatment. And patients that do need IVF are choosing other centers because the new patient waitlist is too long. What's worse is patients often feel unengaged by the clinic because they have little to nothing to do between scheduling their appointment and the visit. Levy Health uses precision diagnostics, including lab testing, cycle data, symptoms, and medical history to triage fertility patients and prepare them for IVF. The first consult can consequently be used to plan and discuss treatment, increasing conversion to IVF. Levy Health's clinical decision support software for fertility and endocrine disorders handles patient pre-screening, diagnostics, and triaging for your fertility clinic to save your team valuable time so you can treat more patients. Levy Health has estimates for improved clinic KPIs: conversion to appointment, no-shows, conversion to follow-up, conversion to treatment, and IVF treatment start. Download these numbers for free at levy.health/conversion. That's levy.health/conversion.
I wonder if there's any kind of rule for folks that if you're not planning to grow to a certain volume, that maybe you don't try to open a satellite office there for part-time, unless it's one of these locations where that's the only way they're gonna get fertility treatment. And there are many rural parts of the country where those are the only places where that doc coming out there a couple of days a week is the only way they can get treatment. There are docs that have their own planes that fly to some of these rural locations that they go out to twice a month. And so,
and even if you can share space, like I said, with another MD, like use it, or a hospital has space, I mean, that kind of lessens some of the burden on cost and overhead if you're able to do that and expand your footprint.
Did you ever share with another REI? Because I have heard of groups doing that.
We have not. I don't have experience in that area. I mean, Overlook, there were other providers there, but not other REIs.
Were they all women's health? Like, does it make sense to?
Yeah, it was all. It was
there, or
it was women's health, and it wasn't just reproductive health either. It was all geared. It was a women's health unit, but it wasn't just all reproductive health.
We got a lot bigger fish to fry than this place that you used to be in an Overlook. But I do think you've laid out a couple of good rules that can make life a little easier for people. One is the sharing space, and people might have thought about that. But I also think having a medical assistant that can also double as the front desk person is very important in a situation like that. That can make life easier for people. Are there any other lessons that stuck out to you of when you had a place that was only open a couple of days, of how you made it not too logistically burdensome?
I mean, I think our IT infrastructure really helps us. We were able to remote into our network and remote into our EMR. So I don't think patients felt it. We also made sure that the ultrasound that we're most familiar with and worked for best imaging was there. So we didn't want our patients that were there to not receive the same quality that they would anywhere else. So we made sure that the basis of the foundation of what we needed to provide the excellent care was still there.
Oh, I think that's a pro tip. So you didn't buy the ultrasound machine there, did you? You chose the providers that were there had the ultrasound machine that you used?
we brought one. We brought our own ultrasound, but it was ours. We leased our ultrasound, so it was a lease that we put there. And when we left, we took it with us. Okay. But like the exam table was there for us, the exam light, the stools, the waiting room chair, the desk, all that stuff was there. So
okay, well then that pro tip is mine then. If people are listening and they select a place that has an ultrasound machine that is like yours, so that's one less thing if you're going out to one of these places where you're only going maybe a couple times a month or once a week. All right.
Yeah, you can find that. That's great.
But Lindsey's pro tip of leasing is probably more realistic in most cases. All right, bigger fish. Moving on back to West Orange and Eatontown, which were two offices. What are the considerations of it? Is it categorically easier to open a new office or to move a new office?
I think from construction wise, I think opening a new office is easier. Usually moving is you're running two offices in tandem. You have to worry about the coordination of the move. You have to make sure that patients know where to go. There's always that time to get them acclimated to the new location. You don't want anyone to miss an appointment. So make sure that you're communicating well and getting the word out that you're moving. And also it's a change for people. So change is always a little harder than something new. I think the hardest is expanding a location, quite honestly. I think that's the trickiest because you have a practice going that you don't want to compromise, but you need to grow it. So coordinating that construction around people working, patients coming in, I think that's the trickiest, to be honest.
Okay, so we got three categories when it comes to location. You're moving, you're setting a new one up, and you're expanding. On the moving side, one pain in the neck that we always had to deal with was the changing of the local listings, which is just not as easy as it should be still. I started doing this stuff like 13 years ago, and it's not any easier, really.
No, even to update your Google location is much harder than I ever thought it would be. My poor marketing team.
And it's critically important. It's one of the most important things. And you can send people to the wrong place. Oh gosh, we had a client where they, for whatever reason, Google was putting the pin in the wrong place of the new spot, and so God bless our
marketing team
had to fix that.
Our RMA marketing team is very good and very proactive, but I know it's hard for them because it's very hard to make sure that you're communicating the right way, that patients are hearing it, that everything's updated, and then there's always someone that misses something, or a referring doc that has an old pad in their office or an old brochure that they give someone.
So when do you make the decision of if you're going to expand or if you're going to move? So let's stick with the example of West Orange because that's where you had moved, right? What was the impetus for doing so, where the previous location was no longer sufficient and now it's time to go to a new place? What goes behind that decision-making process?
So typically when your lease comes up for renewal, we look at economic factors, we look at location factors, we make an analysis of what's best. We look in the market to see if it makes sense to move. Moving is an investment, but sometimes it's the right investment. You have to look at your relationship with the landlord. You moved in 5-10 years ago. Is the building still in good condition? Is if their end of the bargain being upheld? Did the landscape outside the office, did roads change? Is it not ideal? There's a lot of pieces that happen when you're in a lease for 5 to 10 years that are outside of your realm of control. And there's other locations where that 10-year lease comes in and you're just like, oh my God, I want to stay. This is the best location. Like, let's renew, let's expand. But it's definitely a conversation you have to have with the local staff and you have to be involved. And part of my role is also visiting these locations, going out, checking in, seeing how stuff's going, making sure. I have a team that runs day-to-day operations and is involved in all of the day-to-day at these locations. We're very aware of what's happening, not just when we walk in to evaluate that. We're involved the whole period. So we have relationships with the buildings, the maintenance, the landscape. We're out there. So it's important.
And how do you decide when to expand? Because that's got to be a hard decision, maybe perhaps even harder decision, because it seems to me like all of the considerations you just listed are still at play when you're thinking about expanding. And you're ultimately deciding, do we want to do those things here or start anew? So when does it make sense to expand an office location? When does it
funny
not make
enough,
sense?
So 10 years ago when we moved West Orange, when I got involved in that project, remember it was started, but I came in, we just expanded West Orange after being there 10 years in the newer location. We're very happy where we are. We think it's a really great location, but we had thankfully grown. The doctors there have a very heavy referral base, and they needed more space to adequately treat patients, to make morning monitoring more efficient, to add better space for our staff. And there was the other thing with expanding is there has to be availability in the building. So we knew that there was adjacent space, which is the best available. And we knew we liked the location. So we reached out and we started negotiating that deal.
How long did that take?
That one was that was the trickier deal. It probably took me 6 months to get terms that we were happy with. I worked with Dr. Drews, was very involved in that deal, and we worked together and negotiated with the building manager and got that deal secured. And then after that, construction started.
What? I want to
some deals where you
you're moving
expand
fast.
can be in 2 weeks. That was a trickier deal where they were going back and forth. They had other people interested in the space. So
Sure. And was there a lab at that location in West Orange?
there's an andrology lab, but not an embryology lab.
Okay. So then it's not like it's not the hardest thing in the world to move a location like that. Like you said, it's hard, but you also said it's harder to expand. So why expand there instead of going to a new place?
Well, I mean, we liked the location. We liked the building. There was space available. It's significantly less, like more economic sound to expand sometimes than it is to do a whole new location. You have to look at all the factors. If you're in a good location and you're in a good building and you think everything else makes sense and there's that prospect to just add a little bit more, sometimes that's the better economic decision.
Tell us about what goes into the negotiation process. What do you have to make sure that you're on top of?
I think one of the most important things for us is that we have very specific hours. So I want to make sure that there's no issues with the doors being open for my patients when we're open. We like our doors to open either between 5:30 and 6 a.m. Most buildings do not, even medical, do not open that early, to be honest with you. So that's one of our key tenets. We also need HVAC during that time period. We don't want people coming into a freezing cold building or a stifling hot building. We also need to be secure when they're coming in. We don't want them going into a pitch black parking garage somewhere. So those are all kind of the basic stuff that I think we can't even talk if we're not going to meet those basic pillars of access for our patients and safety for our staff. And then we need 24/7 access for MDs, but typically, and like myself, that's typically never an issue with any building. If you're a tenant there, usually getting 24/7, that's not an issue for something critical. And then from there, we go into what makes sense economically, if we're going to do a tenant allowance, if it's a fit out, what they're contributing to the cost versus, and that's economic decision too, because it's really a TI, you are paying that in your rent in some ways. So you have to weigh out all those factors and the timing and all that information for the lease. Typically we negotiate some rent delay into the lease to allow for construction. So
do you have all of this in an SOP checklist now? Here's our standards for HVAC. Here's our standards for what the parking needs to be. Here's our situation for how the badge access needs to be and what time patients need to be able to get in. Is this all in kind of a checklist that you're just that you can send to a landlord?
Yeah, now it is. Now, after many years and each year, I think we get a little more sophisticated and I've gotten better about documenting stuff. And I try not to be one of those people that a lot of stuff stored in my head, which is not great for other team members. So I've tried to get much better at documenting stuff for my team. And then everyone doesn't have to ask me a question. They can look it up and they'll have access to it. And it's much clearer. Also with working, not just a landlord, we're trying to very clearly our expectations with working with an architect or a general contractor. This is what we expect. We're laying it out So we've gotten much better at documenting that stuff. Again, and some of it I'm just documenting. I'm getting from other genius people. Like, I don't know everything, but I've gathered knowledge from people and I have it documented so I know that this is what we need. So a lot of it is just taking all the information you learn and all the data, what the different departments and, what we need to really function great and having it in one place. It's not all knowledge that I developed or I know. I mean, that's key. I'm taking the wisdom from everyone else. I think that's important to realize. And I think that's one of the key things is I spend a lot of time learning the different departments and different areas and learning from all the brilliant people I get to work with, because that's really like where you learn.
You do deserve credit, though, for not letting it just go in your head, though, because that does happen very often where someone does come, they benefit from the institutional knowledge that's kind of there in the ether, anecdotally talking to people. Maybe they compile it for themselves, but they don't get it into an SOP for the organization. And so that is, you deserve some credit for that, because you want to be able to repeat and not have it be all you, so that the next person doesn't have to think about it on their honeymoon. So when you go on your anniversary, your 15th anniversary, you don't have to be thinking about all of this stuff. People can access it from other places. And I've made a couple notes about your team because I want to ask about the team. I could jump all over the place. You've got so much gold in here. So let's stick with negotiation for just a second. Those are all really good places. Is there any kind of phrasing that you learned to be aware of, where there was some kind of phrasing that you were certain meant one sort of thing, and then after you go through something, you're like, oh, that's not what we wanted, or you promised us X and they gave you Y, and is there any type of phrasing that sticks out?
Not so much. I mean, an LOI, I don't need an attorney for. Like, we know our terms, we know our LOI, letter of intent. We know the terms we want to go in there. I mean, when then we get to a lease, we are smart enough to bring an attorney in to look at like the legal jargon that could step us up. And like, I tell the attorney, these are the things like I need to make sure are in my lease. Is there any hidden? I mean, some of these leases are 200 pages long. Is there something hidden in here that I didn't catch that I need to be aware of that's going to make it so my HVAC isn't on, or they're going to close every third Thursday or something crazy, like, or their holiday schedule is X and my holiday schedule is Y. Can I pay to be open, or are they shuttering the doors? So I think it goes back to knowing your operating non-negotiables and putting that in your letter of intent, which is the framework for your lease, and then relying on your legal experts to make sure that there's no legal barrier set up.
Is it always a lease? Do you ever buy?
We own a couple locations. We do. So, I mean, then it's different. It's a little bit easier. But typically most people, especially new people into the industry, usually are leasing their first locations, I would say. It makes more sense. But yeah, we do own some locations.
And I wonder what the breakout is. I wonder if it's much less than a quarter that do. That would be my guess, is that it's a quarter of people that
I don't know.
Maybe it's less than that. Maybe it's
interesting.
We can add that to our ARM team's surveys.
Yeah,
well,
tell April to put that in there.
Yeah. Hey, April, we've got one more survey for you. So when you all decide to buy, what's the criteria behind that? Do you have to be the anchor tenant there? Is it like something that you did with your Basking Ridge location because you got a lot more people and then you can be the anchor tenant? Talk to us about when it's time to buy versus when it's time to lease.
So definitely for us, being the size we were in New Jersey, we were well established. It made sense to have the entire building. We were going to need the entire square foot building, and they wanted to make it a purchase. That was always the intent. We really weren't looking to lease anymore because of the growth they wanted and the flexibility to really design it themselves. So that's what we did there. I mean, we did the original construction, and then I think it was 5 years later, we added 30,000 square feet to our Basking Ridge location. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's an original 60,000, 65,000, and we added about 30,000 to it 5 years later. So
you're talking almost 100,000 square foot building.
Almost. And that sounds a lot more because you have to remember, and you got building areas, you got elevator rooms, you got loading docks. That's the one thing with buildings, and even in leases, they have CAM. So there's different areas that you have to pay for like use, like your entryway. So there's a lot of lost space, even when you own a building, that you have to be aware of. When you lease, you pay for common areas. But when you buy, like, even though it sounds more, there's a lot of not wasted, but there's like lost space. So, like, you need HVAC rooms, you need ductwork, you need electrical rooms. Like, it's not all clinic space ever.
What is that? Common amenities, common access, something?
Yeah, it's common areas maintenance. I believe that's what it stands for. But it's, typically you have those fees in your lease because you're paying to have elevators, entryway, core bathrooms, all that stuff. So you still need all those amenities when you own a building as well. And that takes away from the footage that you have in there.
So it's a big operation in Basking Ridge, but you are the only tenant there, adding these other.
Juno Genetics is out of there, but yeah, all.
Okay. And so, all right, then this is a good segue to get back to when you were starting to move from Morristown to Basking Ridge. You had already done Eatontown and West Orange at that point. One was a new location, one was a move. Now you're back at another move, but at this time it includes the clinic offices, but it also includes the corporate offices and a lab. And so did you leave a lab and a space there in Morristown, or was it completely, we're completely getting out of here and moving into Basking Ridge?
We kept a satellite there. We did not keep an embryology lab, but we kept a small angiology lab, and we kept a satellite office there. So we downsized our footprint in Morristown.
In the same building?
We've now moved. We've just actually moved Morristown in August, but we were there for many, many years afterwards. We kept in the same location. We literally just downsized our current space. Our waiting room was the same. The main entrance was the same into our office in Morristown. We had space on the first floor and the third floor. So we gave up the entire third floor. We gave up part of the first floor, but we kept a location there. And we also phased our move. It wasn't, we all moved on a Friday and opened on a Monday. Departments moved in different waves to help control and allow time for setup and make it more efficient.
So at this time, you're scouting the locations. They had been looking around prior to you even starting. You start in 2008. You start getting more into it in 2010 of starting we're starting the moving process. What did the location scouting process look like?
I mean, you're going to look at location, like how easy is it to get to, any time you go to look at whether it's a satellite, a new build, how easy is it to get to a location? And I'm horrible with directions, if you ask my husband. So I think I'm a really good person because I can get lost, like, going down the street. So if I can get there, I always feel like better that other people can get there. So you want it to, like, be pretty easy to get to off of main thoroughways. If there's multiple thoroughways there like highways, it's more ideal because people from different areas can get there easier. And then you, like, want to have plenty of parking. You want to feel safe, like I said. We like it to look like a place you want to go. You don't want to be like an industrial shipping warehouse going to your doctor's office. I think that the building says something about. And then there's code requirements. Again, parking, we want to have enough, but there's also parking code requirements. There's sometimes having a covered walkway is a requirement. The loading dock where you can put a generator if you need it. Like, there's all those facets that you have to worry about too. And you have to be zoned properly. Like, you have to be able to put medical there, which is one of the key questions.
We should put you as the person that goes to ASRM conference cities before we have to go. And you go through the airport and you point out all the frickin' places where the rideshare signs don't connect to the other part of the rideshare sign.
Oh my God.
Because I can't stand that anymore. So you're doing a little bit of that.
Just had that happen recently, yeah.
It's going to happen to all of us when we go to ASRM this year, and it'll happen again and again. And so you're doing this for the offices themselves physically. How much?
Yeah, I'll typically do the first, like, sometimes someone will see a spot and be like, I was driving past this. Can you look into it? Or I think this building's really great, Lens. Can you see if we can get in there? And I'll typically do, like, the first run through, like, and then I'll shortlist it and typically bring someone else for another opinion or present my findings back to, like, the board or the doc involved, depending on who the right framework is. I'll typically shortlist it. I'll get 15 locations with a realtor that we'll find, and we'll get it down to, like, 3 or 4, and then we'll get other people involved and them to see it or review on a map. There's different variables depending on the undertaking and where it is, but we'll definitely get other people's input.
Well, that's what I want to ask about. How much of it has changed with new technologies coming into play? Like in 2008, we were still printing out MapQuest. In 2008, we didn't have to really consider, can a ride share? I guess you would consider, can a taxi pull up here? But there are different considerations for ride share sometimes. And so now that's into play. We didn't have the virtual tours that we have of all kinds of real estate.
Yeah, the virtual tours, and even when you're working with an architect, they can map out and remove walls and you can walk through it is amazing. I mean, learning how to read a blueprint and really be comfortable and be able to guide yourself through that is very different now.
When did you do that? When did you learn how to read a blueprint?
When I started doing plans, I had to. When I started this role back in 2009, I guess, then 10, that's when I just had to figure it out. I had never really looked at anything other than like a fire escape so much.
I bet there's a lot of people opening offices that still don't know how to read a blueprint. How critical is it and why?
I mean, I think to really like visualize the process, you really have to think about the path and, how everything lays out and how patients are going to walk around and how staff's going to access. So I think it's really important. I know it's hard. I work with colleagues that this is not what they do. And I try to show them a blueprint. They're like, oh, it's so great because the nurses are here and the doc's right here and the lab's over. And they're like, wait, where is? So I get it. It doesn't come. But if you're going to be in charge of it, I think it's really important that you can look at it and really see the different pathways and be able to follow it as a patient, be able to follow it as an employee, and really grasp that it's going to work. Because it's much more expensive to figure that out when walls are up than it is when it's on paper. I mean, even when you're building, they'll spray paint the floors. So that's, I found to be a key time to go walk your site is when the floor plan is spray painted on the floor. Go then and walk around and feel it out.
Well, that's useful to be able to do. So you could theoretically do it with the architect virtually beforehand, but then you can physically go there when they've got things spray painted. And that's a really good pro tip. And so you mentioned that you're doing this with your team. Tell us about who's on that team.
So we definitely, now that we're across the country, I definitely utilize project managers, which will be contract based because we don't have team members everywhere. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to have a long-term team member. Like I said, the docs are usually very involved. And then I have my core team of operations folks that are based out of New Jersey, but that do travel. Also finding the right architects and engineers to work with. They're important. Typically, they'll be local and do site visits. But it's definitely setting the expectations up front for everyone and knowing what you expect and knowing the right times to check in and see stuff. I still think that it's important that I make certain visits or someone on my team that knows makes certain visits. I don't need to be there every day. If I'm building something in New Jersey and I can drive to it, I'm going to be there a lot more often than I can go to like Houston. Mm-hmm. But there were still key times when I had to get on the plane and I had to see it in person, even having wonderful team project managers and people involved. Me and the physician were both in New Jersey at the time. So we had to go there sometimes and really walk it and see stuff in person. Like when it was on the floor, we need to see that layout and really feel it and make sure that stuff was right. And we made changes. So, but it's specialized and it takes people a long time to really learn and get understanding of what goes into it. It's a lot. And some people find it very dull and some people love it. I mean, there's a lot of different facets that I've talked about. There's negotiations, there's the ongoing maintenance, there's the construction. So I luckily have team members who kind of thrive in different areas and we all work together. And I also think it's really important. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I think it's really important, like I said, to work with all the other departments and understand their needs and constantly check in with them and make sure that what I'm doing is still what represents what they need in the field. I can't just go on what worked in 2010 is really what's meeting the needs of the team in 2023, 2024 that we're planning for. I have to constantly be in contact with them and checking them in. They're the experts. I'm building something for them to be able to use and really do the magic. So I have to make sure that I'm checking in with them and seeing what they need and what they want and how they want to portray it. So it's working with the docs and the lab team and the nurses and getting input from everybody.
And you're bringing in people from new areas as you move to those areas beyond your local team. Do you ever hire consultants or are you beyond that, right? You're hiring project
No, for
managers.
The project managers, they're consultants. They're usually a contract and they come in and help just for the projects.
Do you use is there like a vendor of project men, like a company that they have different project managers in different areas, or do you just go hire a firm that's local to that area?
So both. I mean, there are national firms that have offices locally. I've worked with them. I've worked with people that are only based out of local areas. Because even if a company is great, their LA person could be amazing, and their Washington, D.C. person could have never done healthcare and not the right match for me. So we typically try to interview multiple vendors for anything we do and get multiple quotes and do interviews with people, virtual interviews. I'm not flying out there to meet people just to do an interview. Thank God there's these platforms where you can talk to people and see people virtually now, but it is important.
Sure. And so that brings me to my next question, which is probably more of my ignorance about what it actually takes to build a new edification rather than a smart question. But I'm thinking, like, we had clients all over the place, and we'd hire cinematographers or photographers in their area, and then eventually got to a point where it's like, I don't want to hire a cinematographer in Houston and San Diego and Seattle and Toronto and all of these other places. We got this person and maybe a backup that have been killer. I would rather just pay for that person to fly across the country and do that job. And it works for that person because you're lining up their work for them for a year, pretty much, or at least getting them way busier. And it works for us because we have one throat to choke. It's like that's a very familiar person, and we can be a lot more predictive of the quality for the client. Building a building is a lot harder than that. So why not send an architect that has worked really well for you in a couple places in New Jersey out to California?
Are they licensed? They need to be licensed in the local jurisdiction. They need to know all the local laws and regulations. And sometimes we have done that where we've had someone work with that has a partner office in another location. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes there's not someone that we've worked with licensed in that area. And there's also a different cost sometimes if it's not the same office and you have to hire 2 offices and 2 architects. That just financially doesn't make sense, because you do need to be licensed in the area to be able to file. You need to know the local codes. And sometimes cities have codes, and it's not just state. Just because you're in California, San Diego and LA may have different city codes that we have to adhere to. So there's different things that go on. And then general contractors aren't always national, and they also have to be licensed and have staff and buying power and negotiating power in the area. So I would love to have one team. I just hasn't always been possible or always make sense. If in New Jersey, it's a little bit easier. We can reuse professionals. But when we go national, it hasn't always been so easy.
Speaking of those regulations, now that you've worked in a number of different states, what do you find, who's been the hardest state thus far?
I think you learn new stuff with each time. I think that more rural areas, sometimes a little bit easier than a city, just because of the unions and the different regulations, and there's more building going on. Sometimes it's harder, but not always. You get a town that's really difficult in the middle of nowhere where the inspectors and the takes forever, or they have a lot of regulations. So it really depends on the job and everything going on, and also the quality of the documents you put forth, and the team that did your work ahead of time is really important. And we can be in the same city and have done 2 projects and have 2 different realities, because you had a really great GC or you had a really great architect who didn't need to make a lot of changes, or another one who submitted something to the town and the town needed 30 changes.
Are there any regulations that stick out at you? It's like, whoa, I've done this 10 or 12 times. I've never seen that one before, like a municipal regulation or anything that sticks out of note?
No, I think it's just interesting. Some cities, the architect files the permits. Sometimes you need a GC to file the permits. I think that varies, which is interesting. Each town, each city has its own little special quirks. I would say they all really give you a run for your money in some way. It's just working with them and knowing expectations, and you're kind of at their mercy to some extent, because they can stop you from construction and inspections and stuff. So you want to make nice and you want to follow the rules.
So now that you're expanding to now RMA is no longer RMA of New Jersey, you've got IVIRMA, you've got IVIRMA America, IVIRMA Global. What's on the docket for you? What's the next big lesson that Lindsey McBain's going to have to learn?
To delegate. I think the more we grow, the more I do have to trust other people to do stuff. Where I said, I've always been the mindset that I need to see stuff. I need to make sure that it's okay. I need to trust these wonderful people that I work with, that And I know they can do it, but just trust them and release some of the control.
So what do each of them do? You talked about the project managers and the architects and what they do. And then what your in-house team, the one that's with you physically in New Jersey, whether they travel or not, what do each of their roles do?
So I have another person that really just works on construction and projects with me across IVI America. I have someone who works in New Jersey who really, she's amazing at moves. She's mostly just deals with New Jersey. She helps make sure all the day-to-day operations run. Then we also overseen purchasing. So we buy all the equipment and furniture and everything for these new locations. So we added a purchasing specialist to our team this year because we were all doing it ourselves. There's a regulatory person who comes in and makes sure the ASCs are meeting code and looks into the regulations for like UN HSG. She'll call the state and make sure that we are following all that as we set up. And then we have administrative team members that more work on credentialing and the paperwork behind the move. I mean, my role isn't just this. I get involved in a lot of different facets. So my team's a little diversified, which is wonderful because they're all experts in their areas and they help me in the different areas that I need to be over. Instead of them all having to be experts in every area, they kind of help manage their spheres of influence, and they're all amazing. I'm very, very lucky. And like I said, they all value working with the other teams. I mean, I think that's very, like I keep saying, being in constant contact with the lab. Is this the right equipment? Is this the right layout? Like we kind of put it out there, then we walk with them and we're like, okay, this is what we think. What did we screw up? What don't you like? What do we need to tweak? Okay, we just built this office. What did you hate about it? What would you have made different? And then there's certain things that we know we love and we keep trying to recreate that and put in different locations, even if it might not be the ideal first thing. We learn that that's what's best and we add it in.
And each time, are you normally working with the same vendors now? Like we're going to lease our ultrasound from the same folks. We're going to buy our microscopes from the same people. We're going to buy PPE from the same folks. Are you normally going to your current existing vendors, or do you find yourself going to new vendors when you go to new locations?
Well, we try to use the same vendors across the network for economy of scale and purchasing sense. That makes sense. You have better buying power, but we're constantly looking at new vendors. Just because you were the best last year doesn't mean you're giving me the best this year. So we do constantly check and we quote stuff out. Like I said, I'm big on getting multiple quotes for stuff just to make sure that we're still competitive. I think if you just rely on something, you're going to find that you are missing out. Even if you want to go back to your current vendor and be like, you are not competitive anymore because you have a great relationship, that's a discussion you can have. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. I also won't hand over price lists to competitors. That's just not me. I'll tell you you're not competitive, but I'm not going to tell you what Mike down the street selling an ultrasound for. I'm going to tell you to sharpen your pencil. So that's kind of the discussions that I'll have. But I do think you need to be out there and you have to be looking. You can't just say, you know what, McKesson looked good to me last year, so I'm just going to buy everything from it. Maybe Henry Schein or Fisher. You have to shop around. You have to make sure it makes sense. You have to make sure you're getting in the right GPOs. You have to make sure you're looking at economy of scales.
I think that bidding out process could be its own topic. I think there were 10 topics we talked about today. It could be their own topic. But this will be sufficient for the day, and I will be very happy to have you back on, Lindsey. How would you like to conclude to our audience about what wisdom they should impart when considering expanding, starting anew, or moving a location?
I think just to really look at what your team needs and talk to your team and make sure it makes sense for everyone. You look at the economic benefits, look at what your team needs, like what we write for the patients, and getting the big picture. And again, I've said, I think multiple times about this podcast is that I've gotten to work with brilliant people. I've gotten to learn from brilliant people, and I take all that in and really value everyone's input. And I'm just making their ideas happen.
Lindsey McBain, thank you so much for coming on the Inside Reproductive Health podcast.
Thank you for having me.
This episode was brought to you by Levy Health. Seeing more patients for a first consultation may actually decrease IVF revenue by 30 to 40%. To see why, download the numbers for free at levy.health/conversion. That's levy.health/conversion.
Today's advertiser helped make the production and delivery of this episode possible for free to you. But the themes expressed by the guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health, nor of the advertiser. The advertiser does not have editorial control over the content of this episode, and the guest's appearance is not an endorsement of the advertiser. Thank you for listening to Inside Reproductive Health.